Markets and values. Often the market is blamed for obstructing moral or social values. For example, writers for the San Francisco Chronicle referred to how amoral the marketplace can be when explaining why the water supply owned by the city of Stockton, California, could not be entrusted to private enterprise. "Water is too life-sustaining a commodity to go into the marketplace with," the Chronicle quoted the mayor of Stockton as saying. Yet every day, life-sustaining food is supplied through private enterprises. Moreover, most new life-saving medicines are developed in market economies, notably that of the United States, rather than in government-run economies. As for privately run water systems, they already exist in Argentina. The Economist magazine reported on the results of this privatization. Connections to the water and sewerage networks rose, especially among poorer households. Most richer households and families in the city center were already hooked up. Before privatization really got underway in 1995, child mortality rates were falling at much the same pace in municipalities that eventually privatized and those that did not. After 1995, the fall accelerated in privatizing municipalities. The fall was concentrated in deaths from infectious and parasitic diseases, the sort most likely to be affected by water quality and availability. Deaths from other causes did not decline. In Britain as well, the privatized water supply in England has meant lower water bills, higher quality drinking water, less leakage, and a sewage disposal system that complies with environmental regulations a higher percentage of the time than in Scotland, where the government runs the water system. This evidence may be suggestive rather than conclusive, but those who argue for political control of the water supply seldom see a need for any evidence at all. To many people, empirical consequences often matter less than deeply ingrained beliefs and attitudes. Whether in urgent or less urgent matters, many believe that those with political power are better qualified to make moral decisions than are the private parties directly concerned. Such attitudes are international. An entrepreneur in India reported his experience with a government minister there. "I had argued that lowering the excise duty would lower consumer prices of shampoos, skin creams, and other toiletries, which in turn would raise their demand. The tax revenues would thus rise, although the tax rate might be lower. Indian women did not need lipstick and face creams," felt the minister. I replied that all women wanted to look pretty. "A face cream won't do anything for an ugly face. These are luxuries of the rich," he said. I protested that even a village girl used a paste of haldi so that she could look pretty. "No, it's best to leave a face to nature," he said impatiently. "Sir," I pleaded, "how can you decide what she wants? After all, it is her hard-earned money." "Yes, and I don't want her wasting it. Let her buy food. I don't want multinational companies getting rich selling face creams to poor Indians." The idea that third-party observers can impose morally better decisions often includes the idea that they can define what are luxuries of the rich, when it is precisely the progress of free market economies which has turned many luxuries of the rich into common amenities of people in general, including the poor. Within the 20th century alone, automobiles, telephones, refrigerators, television sets, air conditioners, and personal computers all went from being luxuries of the rich to being common items across the spectrum of Americans and among millions of people in many other market economies. The first videocassette recorders sold for $30,000 each before technological progress, trial and error experience, and economies of scale brought the price down within the budget of most Americans. In past centuries, even such things as oranges, sugar, and cocoa were luxuries of the rich in Europe. Not only do third-party definitions of what is a luxury of the rich fail to account for such changes, the stifling of free market by third parties can enable such things to remain exclusive luxuries longer than they would otherwise. Markets and greed. Those who condemn greed may espouse non-economic values, but lofty talk about non-economic values too often amounts to very selfish attempts to have one's own values subsidized by others, obviously at the expense of those other people's values. A typical example of this appeared in a letter to the newspaper trade magazine editor and publisher. This letter was written by a newspaper columnist who criticized the annual profit requirements faced by newspapers due to the demands of faceless Wall Street financial analysts who seem, from where I sit, insensitive to the vagaries of newspaper journalism. Despite the rhetorical device of describing some parties to a transaction in less than human terms, faceless Wall Street financial analysts, they are all people, and they all have their own interests, which must be mutually reconciled in one way or another, if those who supply the money that enables newspapers to operate are to be willing to continue to do so. Although people who work on Wall Street may control millions of dollars each, this is not all their own personal money by any means. Much of it comes from the savings or the money paid into pension funds by millions of other people, many of whom have very modest incomes. If the vagaries of newspaper journalism, however defined, make it difficult to earn as high a return on investments in newspapers or newspaper chains as might be earned elsewhere in the economy, why should workers, whose pension funds will be needed to provide for their old age, subsidize newspaper chains by accepting a lower rate of return on money invested in such corporations? Since many editors and columnists earn much more money than many of the people whose payments into pension funds supply newspapers with the money to operate, it would seem especially strange to expect people with lower incomes to be subsidizing people with higher incomes. Teachers and mechanics, for example, subsidizing editors and reporters. Why should financial analysts, as the intermediaries handling pension funds and other investments from vast numbers of people, betray those people who have entrusted their savings to them by accepting less of a return from newspapers than what is available from other sectors of the economy? If good journalism, however defined, results in lower rates of return on the money invested in newspaper chains, whatever special costs of newspaper publishing are responsible for this can be borne by any of a number of people who benefit from newspapers. Readers can pay higher prices for papers. Columnists, editors, and reporters can accept lower salaries, or advertisers can pay higher rates, for example. Why should the sacrifice be forced on mechanics, nurses, teachers, etc., around the country whose personal savings and pension funds provide the money that newspaper chains acquire by selling corporate stocks and bonds? Why should other sectors of the economy that are willing to pay more for the use of these funds be deprived of such resources for the sake of one particular sector? The point here is not how to solve the financial problems of the newspaper industry. The point is to show how differently things look when considered from the standpoint of allocating scarce resources, which have alternative uses. This fundamental economic reality is obscured by emotional rhetoric that ignores the interests and values of many people by summarizing them via unsympathetic intermediaries such as insensitive financial analysts, while competing interests are expressed in idealistic terms, such as journalistic quality. Financial analysts may be as sensitive to the people they are serving as others are to the very different constituencies they represent. Often, what critics of the market want are special dispensations for particular individuals or groups, whether these are newspapers, ethnic groups, social classes, or others, without acknowledging that these dispensations will inevitably be at the expense of other individuals or groups, who are either arbitrarily ignored or summarized in impersonal terms as the market. For example, a New York Times reporter, writing about the problems of a middle-aged, low-income woman, said, "If the factory had just let Caroline work day shifts, her problem would have disappeared." But, he lamented, "Wages and hours are set by the marketplace, and you cannot expect magnanimity from the marketplace." Here again, the inescapable conflict between what one person wants and what another person wants is presented in words that recognizes only one side of this equation as human. Most people prefer working day shifts to working night shifts, but if Caroline were transferred to the day shift, someone else would have to be transferred to the night shift. As for magnanimity, What would that mean except forcing someone else to bear this woman's costs? What is magnanimous about someone who is paying no cost whatsoever, in this case the New York Times reporter, demanding that someone else be saddled with those costs? Both in the private sector and in the government sector, there are always values that some people think worthy enough that other people should have to pay for them, but not worthy enough that they should have to pay for them themselves. Nowhere is the weighing of some values against other values obscured more often by rhetoric than when discussing government policies. Taxing away what other people have earned in order to finance one's own moral adventures via social programs is often depicted as a humanitarian endeavor. But allowing others the same freedom and dignity as oneself so that they can make their own choices with their own earnings is considered to be pandering to greed. Greed for power is no less dangerous than greed for money and has historically shed far more blood in the process. Markets and morality. Whether assessing the effects of market economies or of government or other institutions, it is a challenge to make a clear distinction between results that emerge from those institutions and results caused by those institutions. Because a given institution or process conveys a certain outcome does not mean that it caused that outcome. As we have seen in Chapter 4, stores in low-income neighborhoods often charge higher prices than in other neighborhoods, but the causes of those higher prices are higher costs of doing business in those neighborhoods, not higher rates of profits resulting from arbitrary price increases by the stores. Many businesses and professions, in fact, avoid low-income neighborhoods because earnings prospects are usually not as good there. The same principle applies to many other institutions, whether in a market economy, a socialist economy, a government agency, or others. Some hospitals have higher death rates than others precisely because they have the finest doctors and the most advanced medical technology, and therefore treat patients with the most difficult, life-threatening medical problems that other hospitals are simply not equipped to handle. A hospital that treats mostly people with routine infections or broken arms may well have a lower death rate than a hospital that performs operations like brain surgery or heart transplants. Higher death rates at more advanced hospitals convey a reality that they did not cause. Similarly, everything that happens in a market economy, or a socialist economy, or in a government agency is not necessarily caused by those institutions. Everything depends on the particular facts of the particular situation. This affects not only questions about causation, but also moral questions. Income differences, for example, may be a result of barriers created against some groups, or a result of factors internal to the groups themselves, such as average age, years of education, and other factors that vary from one group to another. Most people in the Western world, at least, would probably consider arbitrary barriers against particular groups to be morally wrong and something that should be eliminated. But such a consensus is not equally likely if income differences are due to age differences, a factor that evens out over a lifetime, since all of us spend the same amount of time being 20 years old, 30 years old, or 40 years old, even if we are not all simultaneously at the same ages when statistics are collected. Nor is such a consensus likely if income differences are a result of differences in individuals' chosen behavior, such as dropping out of school or going on drugs, since many people feel no obligation to subsidize such behavior. In short, moral decisions depend on factual realities. However, people with different moral values can make different decisions about the same facts. Therefore, the policy question often comes down to whether some people feel that their moral values should be imposed on other people with different moral values through the power of government. Market economies permit individuals to make decisions for themselves, based on their own moral values or other personal considerations, and at the same time, the market forces them to pay the costs that their decisions create. The question is therefore not whether moral values should guide market economies, but whose moral values, if any, should be imposed on others or subsidized by others. Many whose sense of morality is offended by large economic disparities among individuals, groups, and nations tend to see the causes of these differences as advantages or privileges that some people have over others, but it is crucial to make a distinction between achievements and privileges. This is not simply a matter of semantics. Privileges come at the expense of others, but achievements add to the benefits of others. Few of us may have had whatever combination of factors enabled Thomas Edison to make electricity a major part of millions of people's lives. But vast numbers of people around the world benefited from Edison's achievements, both in his own time and in generations that followed. Whatever the sources of Edison's achievements, we have all benefited from those achievements, as we have benefited from the achievements of the Wright brothers and of others who added whole new dimensions to human life. Similarly, for the scientists whose work led to cures or preventatives for crippling diseases like polio or lethal diseases like malaria. Even business leaders who simply found ways to produce goods and services better or to deliver them to consumers at a lower cost contributed to rising standards of living around the world. All these things and more create economic disparities among individuals, groups, and nations with different achievements. That may seem morally offensive to some observers, but here again, moral decisions require an accurate understanding of facts and causes, as well as a clear distinction between privileges and achievements. Moral decisions and policies based on those decisions cannot be made on the simple basis of statistics, visions, and rhetoric, not if the purpose is to make human life better, either materially or otherwise, rather than to indulge one's emotions in disregard of the actual consequences for others. The moral judgment that life is not fair to individuals, groups, or nations in the sense of providing them all with the same factors that promote economic prosperity or other benefits is one that can be shared by people with very different moral or ideological values. As already noted in Chapter 23, neither geography nor culture nor history has presented equal opportunities to all individuals, groups, or nations. Nor have such other factors as demography or politics. In the words of distinguished economic historian David S. Landis, nature, like life, is unfair. But not all sources of unfairness, in the sense of very different life chances, have moral dimensions. No one can be praised or blamed for the temperature of the air, or the volume and timing of rainfall, or the lay of the land. There are, of course, decisions and actions for which human beings can be judged morally, or held responsible legally. But just looking at the bare facts of statistical disparities does not tell us which those are, much less what actions taken now can or will be effective. For that, we need not only facts, but analysis, whether of economics, history, politics, or human nature. We also need to keep in mind a clear moral distinction between doing things that let us vent our pent-up feelings and doing things likely to actually help those who have been unfortunate in the circumstances into which they were born. Transferring income or wealth is relatively easy, but developing human capital among those who lag is far more effective, even if it is also far more difficult. After all, the income or wealth that is transferred has a limited time before it is gone, and continued economic progress depends on having the human capital to replenish this income and wealth as it is used up. Moral decisions cannot be divorced from the consequences they create. Morality is not a luxury, but a necessity, because no society can be held together solely by force. Even totalitarian dictatorships promote an ideology with their particular kind of morality, because not even a government apparatus with pervasive and ruthless powers of repression and terror is sufficient by itself to create or sustain a functioning society. But, while moral principles are necessary for any society, they are seldom sufficient. To apply moral principles to an economy requires knowledge and understanding of that economy, and an ability to think things, not words, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said. Otherwise, attempts to help the poor, for example, may not merely fail, but be counterproductive, if we cannot distinguish people who are genuinely and enduringly poor from people who are simply young and beginning their careers in entry-level jobs that they will soon outgrow, as they acquire human capital that is valuable to themselves and to the society. Making blanket benefits available to the poor can short-circuit this process by making it unnecessary for many people to work, and minimum wage laws can make it harder for the young to find work, costing them both current pay and the acquisition of human capital for the future. Similarly, the need to think things, not words, makes the distinction between privilege and achievement not simply a matter of semantics, but an urgent need for clarity when making moral decisions. Privileges which harm others must be distinguished from achievements which benefit others and advance society as a whole.